Many Bible prophecy teachers have incorrectly said something about Gog and Magog's battle in Ezekiel 38. And I'm probably one of them. We've incorrectly said that Gog and Magog could happen at any moment. Upon some careful study of the words here, I no longer think that it could happen at literally any moment. I believe that there are a few things that need to take place before Gog and Magog can come about. Gog and Magog, at a minimum, is several months away. It could be years. It could even be 1,000 years. There's a lot of possibilities, and we'll talk about those possibilities today on the Cross References podcast. Welcome to the Book of Ezekiel, a cross-references Bible study where we learn how every small piece of the Bible tells one big story and how they all connect to the cross and Christ. My name is Luke Taylor, and I'm ready. I'm ready for the rapture, I'm ready to go to heaven, and I'm ready to see all these end-time things play out. Thankfully for the rest of the world, God is giving us some more time before bringing all these things to pass. There is one element of future prophecy that we really don't know the exact timing of just yet, and that's the alliance and battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we've been studying who the players are over the past few weeks. Now, originally this week, I was going to talk about why Gog attacks. But then after studying these verses a little bit more closely, I decided it'd be more appropriate to talk about when the attack might happen. And then next week, we'll talk about why it happens. So in the first 6 verses of this chapter, we covered the various nations who are going to be involved in the invasion. It's probably led by the Russians. Turkey is definitely a part of it. Iran is definitely a part of it. Almost certainly Libya, and then either Sudan or Ethiopia, and they all come against Israel. And this will have some kind of end times context, although when it's in the end times, that's not entirely clear. So let's read the verses, let's discuss them textually, and then let's go through some of the theories of the timing. Ezekiel 38, verses 7 through 11. Be ready and keep ready, you and all your hosts that are assembled about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples, and now dwell securely, all of them. You will advance, coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes, and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God, on that day thoughts will come into your mind. And remember, this is speaking to Gog. He's the leader of Russia or perhaps Turkey. Thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme, and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls, having no bars or gates. Now, why do I associate this with the end times? Well, the reason I do is because of a phrase there in verse 8. It says, in the latter years. So another way of saying that could be in the last days. It means that this was not a prophecy for Ezekiel's day. This was a prophecy for far, far off in the future. Now, some might say, well, that could just mean any time since Jesus left this earth. It might not have anything at all to do with the end times. And I would just say within this context of this section of Ezekiel, I believe it's talking about events related to the end times. I believe that we're in those end times. The chapters just before this were talking about the regathering of Jews into their land. That's been going on since 1948. The chapters right after this are going to be talking about the Millennium. So in context, I think that this is talking about something that's going to happen in the end times. And I kind of think we've already entered them based on what's going on with Israel. And so then it makes the comment that this is going to fall upon a land that has been restored from war. And this is why I don't think this battle could just happen at any moment. It says it happens to a land restored from war. So Israel needs to fight in some kind of war or conflict before Gog and Magog can happen. Now, if you look at Israel right now, in November of 2024, as I'm recording this, they are currently engaged in warfare, both on their own soil and with Iran in foreign soil. And this has been going on since October 7th of last year. Not necessarily with Iran directly, but this whole conflict that Israel has been dealing with. And so when Ezekiel 38 talks about a land restored from war, the war that it's talking about might be going on this very minute. Which, isn't that exciting? I mean, the conflict that it's talking about right here in the Bible, it could be going on right now, this very moment. And after this current conflict is resolved, then Gog and Magog could take place. So it says in verse 11 that Gog comes against a land of unwalled villages. I think that's key to knowing the timing of Gog and Magog. The wall might not be literal. Walls are a defensive structure. Walls are something that you put up to protect yourselves from invaders. So I take the Bible literally, but that said, whenever it tells us here walls, I'm not sure if that means literal walls or if it's talking about something kind of like the Iron Dome system in Israel. I think it literally means something, and that's what taking the Bible literally means. It means that it's something real, but we recognize the Bible also uses figurative or symbolic language at times. For example, in this chapter, it will talk about how Gog and Magog's forces come against Israel with swords and shields and arrows and riding on horses. Well, those words would have made clear sense to Ezekiel's readers, but in modern times, that's not how we think of doing warfare. So I'm fine with saying that those words could be understood in modern times to refer to tanks or guns or missiles, but I do think those words mean something, okay? I don't think it's just talking about the spiritual arrows of demons. Or you can spiritualize a lot of this stuff away, and that's what many Christians do. They say, oh, the horses, those are the spiritual horses of unbelievers who persecute the church. Now, I don't think that. I think these words literally do mean something, but they could be using symbolic language to communicate it. And so when we think about this phrase, to a land of unwalled villages, we have to think about the idea that this is trying to communicate. Unwalled villages is the Hebrew word perizot, and this means walls, bars, or gates. It means the defensive structure that you put up to protect your people and to keep enemies out. And so for cross-references purposes, the only other places that this word perizot appears is Zechariah 2, verses 4 and 5. Jerusalem shall be inhabited as villages without walls because of the multitude of people and livestock in it. And I will be to her a wall of fire all around, declares the Lord, and I will be the glory in her midst. And another place where it appears is Esther 9:19. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns, or towns without walls, hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So if you look at the context of Esther 9, the Jews have just survived a genocidal attack against them, and it mentions that now the people dwell in safety in towns without walls, in perizot. They feel so secure. They feel like God is the one protecting them. That's what Zechariah 2 is talking about as well. A land that's without walls, it feels secure and safe that God is taking care of them. And so I even wonder, is Zechariah 2 actually a prophecy about Gog and Magog? It's not as specific as Ezekiel 38 and 39. Zechariah 2 is more open-ended, I guess you could say, so you could take it in a lot of different ways. But just read it for yourself. See if you think it's talking about the same thing. That the people feel so secure that God is protecting them that they aren't even worried about having walls to protect them. And that is what Israel's attitude is going to be as Ezekiel 38 comes up. They feel so secure, they've even laid down their defenses. Now, as I said before, that's not been the story in Israel, really not even since it began as a nation in 1948, or re-began as a nation. They have always been surrounded by enemies. They have constantly had to deal with rockets and attacks from their enemies at any given time. And so Ezekiel 38 opens up on an Israel that is unlike the Israel that any of us have observed in our whole lifetimes. And I'll say something about current events, and don't take this as an endorsement or a defense of any candidates or of voting or anything like that. I'm not freaked out about this election at all. Okay? I feel just very secure that God is in control no matter what happens. And you probably remember a few years ago, Donald Trump had several Middle East peace deals in the pipeline just before he lost the 2020 election. And those peace deals have not been moved forward by the Biden administration. And so if Donald Trump gets reelected, and if he restarts those peace negotiations that he kind of left on the table from before, and if he brought peace to that region, then we could very well have a scenario where Ezekiel 38 could take place. That is how close we could be. We aren't there right now, but it could be within months or within years down the line. And so for Israel to be a land without walls means that it feels like there's just no pressing threat right now. And then that's when Gog and his alliance of nations is going to feel like they can get away with striking at Israel. And so verse 9 says that they will descend upon Israel like a swarm, like a wave, like a storm or a cloud covering the land. That there's going to be so many troops and so many quote unquote horsemen. And why is Gog doing this? Well, there's several reasons, and we're going to talk about those next time. But for now, let's talk about when. When might this attack take place? Well, let's start by establishing the timeline of things to come. This is going to take just a minute, but we've got to make sure that we're all on the same page as we jump into all this. So prior to Jesus coming back, there will be a 7-year period of tribulation on the earth. The 7 years comes from Daniel 9, and the description of what will happen during that time comes in the book of Revelation. After the 7 years of tribulation is finished, Jesus will return to this earth, and this is the second coming of Christ. This is the end of the world as we know it. Jesus is back, and he begins a 1,000-year reign that's known as the Millennium. And I'm one of those Christians who takes the Millennium as a literal 1,000-year period. In a few months from now in this podcast, we're going to be going into a deep dive of what all the Millennium entails. Because the Bible says a whole lot about this time period. We really don't study it all that much, and it's kind of mysterious to us. So I really want to do a deep dive into that. But anyway, where does the rapture fit in on all this? There's a few different theories about that. I tend to place the rapture at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation. My main reason is that the tribulation is called God's wrath, and the Bible says that we believers are not appointed to wrath. That's a whole other topic on its own. I've done several episodes talking about the rapture right here on this pod, and you can search them up if you'd like to. But the basic timeline goes like this. We are looking to the rapture as the next major event on God's calendar, and it could come at any moment. There are things that could happen before the rapture takes place, but there's nothing that has to happen. And so at some time after the rapture, and I would say probably shortly after, the 7-year tribulation will begin. And at the end of that is the second coming of Christ. But the second coming of Christ is not the end of sin. There's going to be a 1,000-year reign of Christ physically on this earth from Jerusalem. And at the end of that 1,000 years will be the final judgment. Then sin will be done away with. And then there will be a new heavens and a new earth, and it will be remade to last for all eternity. So believe it or not, there's a whole list of options right there where you could place Gog and Magog on that timeline. The Gog and Magog conflict, it is not solidly tied to any one location in Scripture. There could be one, and we're going to get to that, but let's just go in chronological order. We'll start at number one place where you could place it, before the tribulation. Gog and Magog could take place prior to the tribulation. It doesn't have to be attached to any of those other things I mentioned before. Now that Israel's back in their land, 100 years could go by before the rapture and tribulation even begin. That is a real possibility, okay? Technically, this could all happen with Gog and Magog before any of that other stuff even gets started. Like Putin could get the idea, he could start putting his coalition together right now. As I said, I don't think it's going to happen this year. Okay, Israel is currently embroiled in a conflict. As I'm recording this, we're here in the first weekend of November. You're going to hear this in a few days. There's been chatter on my Telegram app and on Twitter all week long that Iran is poised to strike Israel, and that that Israel might even strike Iran first. Just 13 minutes ago, while I was recording this right here, I get a headline on my phone from Daily Wire. It says, Iran vows revenge, U.S. moving heavy bombers to the Middle East. So there's stuff going on right now, and by the time you listen to this episode in a few days, you could know more than me, okay? So tensions are very high right now in Israel. But in Ezekiel 38:11, Gog said, not God, Gog said, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. So that verse right there, that's what I really see as key to figuring out the timing of this conflict. 38:11, Ezekiel 38:11. That is the key verse to look at if you're trying to see whether Gog and Magog could happen at any moment. And this cannot logically apply right now to Israel's situation. But as I said, perhaps the current conflict could lead to a scenario of peace for Israel, and this paves the way for the battle of Gog and Magog. And that makes sense, because if we jump ahead a little bit in the narrative of this battle, it's going to say in the aftermath section in Ezekiel 39:9, then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and make fires of the weapons and burn them, shields and bucklers, bow and arrows, clubs and spears, and they will make fires of them for 7 years. So we know that Israel is going to use the weapons for fuel or as an energy source for 7 years after this battle. We'll talk soon about what all that could mean as well, but that means it fits very nicely to place this battle of Gog and Magog before the tribulation, because the tribulation itself is a 7-year period of time. And a reason that Gog and Magog might not be prior to the tribulation is a line in Ezekiel 39:8. And my holy name I will make known in the midst of my people Israel, and I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore, and the nations shall know that I am the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So if this takes place before the tribulation, then that's kind of an odd verse, because we know that the Israeli people are not going to collectively acknowledge Jesus until the end of the tribulation. And a lot of nations are going to be deceived into following and worshiping the Antichrist after all this, if you place it before the tribulation. It also says in 39:28, then they shall know that I am the Lord their God, because I sent them into exile among the nations, and then assembled them into their own land. I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore. So verses like this can cause prophecy teachers to say, well, see, Gog and Magog must take place at the end of the tribulation, or at the end of the millennium, because everybody gets saved at the end of it. And that's a way to possibly read this. I'm presenting some counterpoint here, okay? I'm not saying that that's wrong, but another way to look at this verse could be this way. Perhaps this isn't the moment that all the Jews get saved. It might be more of a moment where they're all awakened to the reality of God. Like right now, many Jews are secular or atheistic or agnostic. They're very lukewarm toward God. But we see in Ezekiel 37 that the Jewish reawakening to God, it is happening in stages. It's a slow progression. And so perhaps this miraculous salvation from Gog's armies, maybe it's going to make the Jews kind of realize, whoa, like God really is real. And I don't mean that they're just going to jump straight into believing the gospel at that point, but maybe it's going to be more of a spiritual awakening within them. And then they will go into the tribulation believing that God is real, even if they're not saved yet. Okay? They're just going to believe in the reality of God. All right? It says at the end of 39, I will leave none of them remaining among the nations anymore. You see, right now, most of the world's Jews are back in Israel, but many of them are still scattered throughout the world. Here in America, we still have Steven Spielberg and Bob Dylan and Chuck Schumer. There are a lot of Jewish individuals still here in America. But if the Jews of the world, if they say, well, wow, God must be real. I mean, look at how he's protecting Israel. Then that could very well drive them to say, well, I got to migrate back to my homeland. And they will take off back toward Israel and bring all of this about. So the battle of Gog and Magog, it could be something that drives the rest of the world's Jews back home, especially as anti-Semitism keeps rising throughout the world and maybe makes them feel less welcome even here in America, and makes them think, well, I know if I'm in Israel, I've got God protecting me there. So to me, that's what makes this really attractive, to place Gog and Magog prior to the start of the 7-year tribulation, because I could really see this conflict setting the stage for the events of the tribulation. And then we could get Chuck Schumer out of our government and send him on. Yeah, that's a really good thing if you don't like him very much. And once all of the Jews are back in their homeland, I mean, then it really has them honestly, right where the Antichrist wants them as you look at what takes place in the book of Revelation. So another place that people place Gog and Magog is right when the tribulation begins. And I will explain why. The 7-year tribulation, it really begins, what kicks off the 7 years is the appearance of the Antichrist. It says in Daniel 9:27, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. Now, if you want to, you can go back to episode 50 of this podcast if you want to know more about what that means. Essentially, it is saying that the Antichrist is going to make a 7-year covenant or treaty or agreement between nations, and then halfway through it, or at the 3.5-year point, he puts an end to sacrifice. He will commit the abomination of desolation. This desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. The Jewish people will be scattered. And so the 7-year covenant of the Antichrist, that is the 7-year tribulation. That is what kicks it off whenever that covenant goes into effect. Now let's go to Revelation 6, verses 1 and 2. It says, now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, come. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. So the rider on the white horse, that is the Antichrist. He's holding a bow, and this represents a covenant or a treaty. If you want more information on why that is, you can go back to an episode I did called The First Horseman of the Apocalypse. And basically the Antichrist appearing, he's given a crown, he's placed in charge of the world, or the strongest empire in the world. And he appears as the first judgment of the 7-year tribulation. Here's the second judgment of the tribulation, verses 3 and 4 of that chapter. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. So right after the Antichrist makes his 7-year agreement, war breaks out across the planet. The second horse is a war horse. Many people think that the Antichrist 7-year agreement is a peace treaty, and it might be. I try not to assume more than what the Bible says. It doesn't say it's a peace treaty, but if it is a peace treaty, then that's kind of ironic, I guess. It's darkly funny that immediately after this, World War III breaks out. The war horse shows up. And some say that the World War III will actually be the battle of Gog and Magog. One really attractive reason to place it here is because of a verse I read earlier in Ezekiel 39:9. Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and make fires of the weapons and burn them, shields and bucklers, bow and arrows, clubs and spears, and they will make fires of them for 7 years. And so since it mentions 7 years right here, this makes some people say, well, that must be the 7-year tribulation. And I'm fine with that. I mean, that it slots in there perfectly. My issue with that, though, is just kind of goes back to this idea of what happens at the midpoint of the tribulation. The Antichrist is going to be turning on the Jews and starting a genocide against them. And so it just seems a little strange to me if some of those Jews are hanging around and keeping the weapons burning that it talks about right there in 39:9. So that's why I think they need a little bit more than the time slot that the tribulation affords them. That's why I don't lean toward putting this at the beginning of the tribulation. I think it actually makes more sense to push it a few years before the tribulation even begins. I see it as something that more so sets up the tribulation. But there are some scholars, a lot of scholars, who put it right here. And I'm not against them having that belief. Charles Lee Feinberg, in the Prophecy of Ezekiel commentary, he says, placing the conflict in the tribulation is the theory which best harmonizes the prophetic scheme of the eschatological passages of the Old and New Testament. So it's popular to place it right here. You can make of that what you will. One more interesting tidbit, because we're in the context of the horses of Revelation right here. And again, I broke down the horses of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what they're popularly called. That comes from Revelation 6. And I did 4 episodes on them in 2022. You can go back. I think it was like summertime of 2022 if you want to go back and listen to those episodes. And you can find out what they all mean. if you want to go way back to then and listen to those episodes, each of the 4 horses has a color. The first is white, the second is red, the third is black, and the fourth is green. And what's interesting about these colors is that they are the colors of the Muslim flags of the world. If you look at the flags of Muslim nations, they are white, red, black, and green. And by the way, that Palestinian flag that you see a lot of ignorant protesters waving around all the time, the Palestinian flag, white, black, red, and green. And whenever you look at the nations of the Gog and Magog alliance, if you look at all of their flags are white, red, black, and green. All of them except for Russia. Russia has a blue flag. So anyway, can I prove that any of this means anything? No. I just find it an interesting connection, or you could call it a coincidence, I guess. Maybe it's a hint. Maybe it's a hint that the Muslim nations, or even the nations of Gog and Magog, that they have an important role to play in the beginning of the tribulation. And so some place this conflict right after the tribulation begins. I'm going to take a quick break and get a drink, and then whenever I come back, we're going to look at a third place you can place this Gog and Magog prophecy, at the Battle of Armageddon. Okay, so I'm back, and good grief. I mean, things just keep happening. I said by the time you hear this Monday, you're going to know more than me. As I'm recording this, my phone's still lighting up a thing here that says pray for Israel. 120 drones and missiles were launched at Israel today. Israeli attack helicopters are constantly chasing drones over the north of the country. So, I don't know what's being said there. It's in a different language, but I'm watching helicopters, and I guess these are drones maybe flying over Israel airspace and people shooting at them, or perhaps it's the helicopters shooting at the drones and all that. Looks like a helicopter chasing a drone. So this is stuff going on right now in our world. As I was saying, Gog and Magog cannot happen this week because it says it's going to happen to a land of unwalled villages. That's kind of my point here is I'm talking about the timing of Gog and Magog. There's some things that have to take place. Israel has to feel secure in its land. And basically at a time of peace, they don't have that right now. They're not going to have that till this conflict with Hezbollah. I think they've kind of taken care of Hamas, but they got to wrap things up with Hezbollah and get to some kind of peace deal or whatever with Iran, where they're just doing this thing right now where Iran launches hundreds of missiles into Israel and it's but we're not at war, guys. And then Israel responds by killing some of their leaders or blowing up some of their military bases, but we're not at war, guys. And it's just kind of this war, but not official war thing that they have going on. This has got to come to an end before Gog and Magog can play out. So anyway, I think I made that clear. We'll get back into the lesson. Places where you can place the timing of the Battle of Gog and Magog. Number one, I said you could put it before the tribulation. That's my personal favorite place to stick it, before the tribulation even begins. I would even say a few years before the tribulation begins. Another popular place is right at the start of the tribulation, basically with the red horse of Revelation 6. Another great place you could put it. A third view that sees this Gog and Magog conflict is the Battle of Armageddon, which is spoken of in Revelation 19. This is the final battle of the Antichrist. This is where Jesus shows up and obliterates him and all his forces. And this could make some sense with the 7 years that it said after this battle, they're going to be burning the weapons for 7 years. And that 7-year period, that could, I guess, go right into the millennium. That is possible. But I really feel like this is the weakest option of where you could place Gog and Magog. So first of all, there's many differences in the two battles whenever you compare the descriptions of these two conflicts. In Gog and Magog, it has a really specific set of nations who come against Israel, and it says that they attack Israel from the north. But whenever you read about Armageddon in Revelation 19:19, it says, "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies, gathered to make war against him, who was sitting on the horse, and against his army. Joel 3:2 says, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Zechariah 12:3 says, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. So to me, and that's talking about Armageddon. Armageddon sounds a lot more comprehensive than Gog and Magog. Gog and Magog is just this specific group of maybe like 5 nations. Then the conclusion of the battle is going to be kind of different as well. In Armageddon, Jesus comes back and just basically melts everybody's faces off right where they're standing. Okay, the mere appearance of Jesus is like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he basically just his appearing is enough to kill them in a very gruesome way. It's described in Revelation 19. It's described in Zechariah 14, and it's gross. It's gory and goopy, and you don't even want to think about it. And that is why that is how that battle ends, the Battle of Armageddon. At the Battle of Gog and Magog, you're going to see in a few weeks, it's a little bit different. They launch their weapons at Israel, and their weapons get slapped back at them. And there's some more things that happen. As I said, we'll get into it in a few weeks. But the details just seem kind of different from what we hear described in Revelation. And the main thing that I really go back to, again, is Ezekiel 38:11, the Land of Unwalled Villages. That really doesn't seem like a term that could describe Israel or Jerusalem at the end of the tribulation, because they're basically been scattered again, and they're not even dwelling in Jerusalem at the end of the tribulation. So I have to vote not permanently, just for a few years. They're on the run from the Antichrist, okay? So it's not a major scattering in that sense, like the Babylonian captivity, but they run out of town because there's a genocide being attempted against them. So I just have to I had to vote a big thumbs down on placing Gog and Magog at the end of the tribulation. And then another view, a fourth view that we'll talk about today, the last view I want to talk about today, is placing Gog and Magog at the end of the millennium. And there is some very strong scriptural support for putting it right here. The chapter that really boils the millennium down to a nutshell is Revelation 20. At the end of the millennium, Jesus is going to give anybody who's been born on the earth during that 1,000-year period and who is still alive, he's going to give them the option of following him into eternity or coming against him in a final battle. Now you say, why would anybody want to rebel against Jesus after being led by him for 1,000 years? Well, I have no earthly idea why somebody would want to do that. Maybe we'll get a little bit more context after we do our Millennium study next year. But what I really think this speaks to is the fact that everybody has a choice. Jesus does not force our love. And so in the Millennium, remember, sin has not been done away with just yet. The new heavens and the new earth comes after the Millennium wraps up, right after this battle of Armageddon. The new heavens and the new earth comes after the Millennium wraps up, right after this battle of what could be Gog and Magog. So people could still choose to sin up to this point. They could even rebel against God up to this point. I don't think it's going to be most people, but anybody anywhere in the world is going to have that option as the 1,000 years conclude. And so it says in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So obviously, Gog and Magog get a name drop right there in Revelation 20, and that makes it seem very obvious that this is the best place to place that famous battle of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And there's many Bible scholars who place it there. I think Hal Lindsey is one of them. And so, listen, I'm not going to dog on anybody for putting it right here. I mean, it kind of makes sense. But some of the weaknesses of this view, they're kind of similar to the Armageddon problem. In the final rebellion here at the end of the millennium, it says that the nations from the four corners of the earth are going to come against the camp of the saints. Gog and Magog just mention a few specific nations. Also, the conclusion of this battle is that the fire goes down from heaven to wipe these rebels out. So they obviously aren't studying their Bible well if they're going to actually try to rebel against Jesus in the millennium. But this is, again, it's something kind of different. Ezekiel 38 talks about their weapons getting slapped back in their faces. So this could all be the same event. But if this is at the end of the millennium, and the new heavens and the new earth are right after this, everything in the old heavens and the old earth is going to be wiped away with fire, totally burned away. And so I just don't know how to make sense of the verse in Ezekiel 39, where it says that they're going to be burning the weapons for 7 years after this. It just doesn't fit if you put it there at the end of the millennium, in my opinion. And you say, but wait a minute, Luke. It literally says in Revelation 20, Gog and Magog. So why would it say Gog and Magog if this isn't Gog and Magog? Let me read it again. Revelation 20, verses 7 and 8. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So why is Gog and Magog mentioned right here if this isn't literally Gog and Magog? Well, even though it mentions it here, and again, it's perfectly fine to place it here based on that, it is my belief that Revelation is bringing up Gog and Magog right here because it's a callback. It's saying this is going to be like the Gog and Magog of Ezekiel 38. This is like that battle that happened 1,000 years ago. Now, why do I interpret it that way? Because Revelation does that all the time. Revelation is full of callbacks to previous parts of the Bible. I've heard it said that there's more than 400 allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. I call them allusions because I don't think the book of Revelation actually directly quotes the Old Testament. And that's a very curious thing because it is full of references to the Old Testament. New Testament books do literally quote from the Old Testament constantly. But Revelation, to my memory, it never directly quotes from the Old Testament, but hundreds of times it will reference things from the Old Testament. Okay, for example, in Revelation 11, it talks about the two witnesses, and it calls them the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. That right there is a callback to Zechariah 4, where it's talking about some guys named Zerubbabel and Joshua. But in Revelation 11, it calls the two witnesses the olive trees and the lampstands. So Revelation, sometimes what it does is it reappropriates Old Testament terminology and applies them to future events. And I believe that's what it's doing right here by mentioning Gog and Magog. And so there you go. That's the fourth place you could put it at the end of the millennium. And let's go ahead and close down for today. So next time on this podcast, we're going to get into the why of the Gog and Magog conflict. And I hope you're not tired of the words Gog and Magog at this point, because we still have more to discuss on this. Next week, if we survive the election, then we're going to regather here and we're going to talk about why this conflict takes place. So make sure that you're subscribed so you can get that episode. And in closing today, as we talk about timings, all right, that's the theme today, the timings of these end times events. I just thought it'd be neat to share a brief clip from the interview that took place this past week between Joe Rogan and Donald Trump. Did anybody else listen to this? Donald Trump was speaking about foreign policy, specifically speaking about the Middle East, and he made this comment.
Is it possible that there's some military or government program that you weren't, that they didn't tell you about?
I think I had a great relationship with the military, basically, but I didn't like certain people. I would have gotten them out if I thought if the election was different, I would have fired all of them quickly. Most of them I did fire. Biden should have fired every military person involved with Afghanistan. He should have had a lot of firings. If you look at him, he told Israel not to do anything, and at least Israel's not going to look at a bomb the way they would have been. Think if they listened to Biden. They'd be waiting for a bomb to drop on their head right now. He's been wrong about so much. I guess you'd have to say that she's been wrong too, because she always said they made the decision together. But Israel didn't follow his advice. And I think it was a very, the Middle East is rapidly changing. There are prophets that say the world will come to an end in the Middle East. You know that, right? And we have weapons today that are so scary. When you look, I rebuilt them all. And when you look at the weapons we have today, the biggest threat we have in the world today is nuclear weapons. And we have other weapons, too, that are devastating. But the nuclear weapons, the biggest threat we have in the world today. And that's what I was talking about de-escalation with both China and Russia. I'm telling you, we were going to de-escalate. They were going to de-escalate. You got to be careful. It's a little tricky playing with them because they say we're going to do it and they don't do it maybe. But they understood the curse, too. It's a curse. It's China's way behind us, but they'll catch us within 5 years.
I know he kind of rambles, and it can get kind of frustrating to listen to Trump at times because he just kind of goes from one topic to another to another. If you listen to the whole 3-hour interview, and if you're into that kind of thing, you can. It makes more sense in context. Like, you can follow what he's saying a lot better. Anyway, don't take me playing that as some kind of political endorsement of any kind. Okay, we got the big election this week. If your conscience leads you to vote for Donald Trump, go for it. If your conscience says he's too pro-choice and too pro-LGBT to vote for, then don't vote for him, okay? I can respect that as well because that's a principled position. I do hope that you will jump in as a Christian. If you're a Christian listening, I hope you will vote in the other races because there are many other issues, many other people worth voting for on the ballot. So please don't just sit out the election because you might not like the choices at the top. That's all I'll say about that. Anyway, don't take it as an endorsement. And I'm playing this here because I wanted to save it for a later episode, but then I realized if Trump doesn't win this week, then this clip is really not even going to be relevant anymore. So I wanted to go ahead and share it here because it's just fascinating to me. Okay. This is fascinating with that we have somebody running for president who has very few Christian qualities, but he does have an awareness of the biblical significance of the Middle East. And he recognizes right there, I played that 2-minute clip because I wanted you to hear, he recognizes the major players on the scene, Russia, China, Israel, the Middle East. The book of Revelation talks about China coming at Israel in the tribulation, and that the end of the world is in the Middle East. It's centered around the Middle East. Ezekiel talks about Russia being a part of this thing too. And so it's never going to stop being fascinating to me that these nations that the Bible talked about 2,500 years ago in prophecies, that they are the ones that keep coming up in our modern political discussions today. And that's what tells me, as far as timing goes, that the end times might be right around the corner. I mean, we might actually be in them literally at this moment. So one last note about timing. All of these things are going to come to pass. Exactly how God said they would, it's going to happen. That's why I don't really worry about this election. I'm not freaked out about it, okay? Do I have an outcome that I would prefer? Sure. And I mean the outcome that I would have most preferred, the ship sailed on that a long time ago. Okay? America is in a dark place when these are the choices before us. But God is in control, and he is going to bring about what he wants to bring about. So if Donald Trump gets in, maybe he brings about that peace that Ezekiel 38 is talking about when it talks about Israel being a land of unwalled villages. Maybe it gets turned into that. And then Gog and Magog could happen soon, and we might lose Bob Dylan, but that's okay because we're that much closer to the end anyway. And if Kamala Harris gets in, Bible prophecy is still going to come to pass. It's going to come to pass in God's timing, and that's going to be the best timing. An election in America is not going to derail God's plans. Thanks for listening to this Cross References Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. This has been Luke Taylor, and I hope the Bible makes more sense to you after this episode.